Firstly, I'd like to thank our online audience for joining us for tonight's Don't Divide Us event, the CRED report, critiquing the substance, moving past the smear campaign. Needless to say, the report has caused quite a stir since its publication, and the quality of discourse surrounding it has been somewhat of a low quality. So we're really hoping through this event, we'll get down to really tackling the substance of the report, the main themes, what the stronger elements of the report, what could be further built upon, and crucially focusing on the policy recommendations, what kind of shape could they take going into the future. So before we start off with the opening statements from our wonderful panelists tonight, I'll make a few brief introductions. Firstly, we have Kunle Olulode, who is the director at Voice for Change England, a Black, Asian and minority ethnic charity and infrastructure support body. Kunle is also the founder of the Camden Black History Forum and sits on the programming board for the South Banks British Films Institute's African Odyssey. And he was a co-opted member of the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities. We also have Martyn Oliver. Martyn began teaching back in 1995 when I was at the tender age of 5 myself. And he's a chief executive and accounting officer of Outward Grange Academies Trust and a national leader in education. And he was a commissioner for the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities. Then we have our very own Don't Divide Us founding member, Alka Sehgal Cuthbert, a founding member of DDU and an educational advisor and writer. She's a co-author of What Should Schools Teach? And then we have Calvin Robinson. Calvin is a political commentator, educational consultant, and broadcaster. And he's also a founding member of Don't Divide Us and a campaign group, the campaign group Defund the British Broadcasting Corporation. Last but not least, we have Zara Qureshi. Zara is a politics and modern foreign languages graduate. She's a project manager at the Quano Project and is a founding member of the Free Speech Champions.
I think what's really welcome about this, about the report, is that its insistence that racism cannot alone be a singular, all-determining cause for any social problem or social phenomena. Social life is far too complex, and that's because people aren't closed systems that can be analysed fully in the way of physical objects. I think another good thing to get out in public is that not all disparities can or should be automatically read off as evidence of discrimination. And I really like the approach of asking, when it comes to thinking about recommendations, of your starting point being what will improve life for all, rather than trying to sort of address people in sections or kind of tick box groups. So I think these are really important points for both public understanding, for politicians, and I think also for social scientists in academia who research these questions and who often have close links with policymakers to take more seriously. However, I do have some criticisms, and I'm confining them to section on education, which is my sphere of interest and expertise. And I think here that the report does rely too much on statistics, which I think are useful in describing something that is to be the object of study, but statistics can't provide a value judgment or a reasoned rationale, as opposed to a scientific cause, for choosing X over Y, or say a liberal colourblind concept of racism or anti-racism over a critical race theory-based concept, for example. Now, the report doesn't just stick with statistics. There are some sociological theories that are pointed to by way of trying to explain some of the disparities especially between Black Caribbean pupils' achievements and those groups who perform better. And those three main theories are immigrant paradigms, selective assimilation, and family aspiration. And I'll look a little bit more in detail in a minute. So this is better than just sort of statistics alone, but I think it's insufficient. And I would want to ask, why is there no or so little educational and curriculum theory that could, I think, provide fresh and more precise understandings of educational processes? And I want to just go through a quick example from the report to sort of illustrate what I mean here. So one example from the report shows that there is an important disparity that does need investigating and a better account. And Martyn's already referred to it, but here is, on page 59, you'll find a chart which is showing percentage of pupils reaching a different attainment levels by ethnic group over the year 2018 to 2019. So 4 to 5-year-olds meeting developmental standards, there is an 8% difference between Black Caribbean pupils near the bottom and Chinese pupils near the top. When we move on a few years to 10 to 11-year-olds, looking at their achievements in reading, writing, and maths, that difference gap has gone up to 24%. And by the time we get to 16-year-olds with strong passes in GCSE, English, and maths, there's a 50% difference. So this is something that does need explaining, right? There have been no major changes in education provision or assessment over the last 10 years that I think could explain this growing gap in the probability of a Black Caribbean child doing progressively worse as they go through 10 years of schooling. So according to the theories that I mentioned a minute ago, so Black Caribbean pupils as an ethnic group, you could say, are not recent immigrants. So that they've been here for a long time and maybe suffered more, have a longer family history of social or racial disadvantage, which makes them less liable to want to do well. They're said to be less successfully socially assimilated, the selective assimilation theory, into accepting a cultural value of education as a tool for social mobility. And then there's the aspiration theory, which is linked to that, which is about the individual pupil or individual families' sort of self-perception and aspiration of educational achievement. So I think while these sort of seem to have some merit, I think they also miss something. There's something not quite satisfactory about them. And I think what's missing is looking at education itself. And I think we need to be asking different types of questions here. Because if education is understood, valued, and promoted as a means to something else, whether that be jobs or social mobility, when most of the broader socioeconomic trends have been to reduce both or to create a skewed economy, the sort of famous hourglass shape of economy where you have jobs at the top and jobs at the bottom, but few in the middle. And then you combine that with the kind of impact of, free internal markets of labour with the European Union, then you can see, you could see, well, why would a reasonable person feel aspirational or internally motivated? Because if you're saying you should aspire to education because it's going to get you a job or you're going to be more socially mobile, but your reality is that isn't going to happen, then why would you bother with education? And then I think on top of that, you've got decades of different forms of instrumentalization of knowledge in the curriculum. You've had the deprofessionalization of teachers as professionals. Martyn, I'm not talking about you, by the way, just generally, within a liberal humanistic culture. And they're our reframing, I should say, because I'm a teacher as well, as technical facilitators, valuable as long as we deliver empirical results and qualifications. Then is it any wonder that we have such systemic problems of teacher recruitment and pupil motivation and aspiration? Because if we know that the instrumental goods of education we're constantly being told are there to be had, but are unlikely to be coming our way, then you switch off, right? Or you might do. I'm just saying that's a possibility, that kind of questions we could be looking at. And then if we're talking about Black Caribbean pupils in particular, let's look at the broader political change. There may not have been a significant change in the education system, but what happened in 2012 with the hostile environment policy? That largely, who did it affect? It largely affected the Windrush generation of Black Caribbean families. So I'm not saying that I'm not asserting, I haven't researched this at all, but I'm just saying that a kind of broader, deeper thinking might help frame better research questions to understand what's actually happening. And especially when we're considering sensitive questions to do with cultural affinities between families and individuals and state institutions. Now, in the report on page 56, we can see that there is this sort of indication there where it says too many people are dropping out of university or not getting graduate jobs several years after graduating. Better guidance is needed on course selection, and we need to promote a wider range of attractive and rewarding alternatives. I don't disagree with that last part at all, but I think it's kind of secondary, because what's happening here is that an educational value judgment has been sneaked in, not deliberately, I don't think, and it's not surprising given the debate on education, but it does need to be made explicit. We need to decide collectively what educational functions do we think are most important: qualification, sorting for employment, preparation for university, socialization into a common culture, individual subjectification or personhood, social improvement or social justice, or intergenerational transmission of inherited canonical knowledge. Those are the kind of main contenders there. And we need to decide they're not all compatible, right? You can't just put in a bit of both, a bit of everything, and think you're going to come up with a tasty educational stew. You won't. You'll come out with a mess that, largely we have, even though there have been really good attempts to try and address some of these problems. So, to come to our concluding bit, I think without being clear and making value judgments on these kinds of questions before making practical recommendations, before commissioning research, then the hidden values that shape today's public understanding, which are largely instrumental, get reproduced spontaneously. So I think it's not really, the recommendations I wouldn't disagree with. Who would disagree with good teaching, good curriculum, or high aspiration? But they're just too general. And also, good is a value judgment, and you can't arrive at that empirically. It needs a different kind of discussion first. So another example, recommending guidance for higher education institutions to address disparities in university applications. I think that's number 15 under creating agency. I'm not against outreach work, and I'm not against the work that Oxbridge and other universities are doing to encourage people, but it's a bit too late by then, I think. And also we need to consider the prior question is, do we want to encourage a view that unis are there for jobs? Do we really want to reject the idea of unis as a place for intrinsic love of study and academic work, or limit it to the wealthy only?
Alka, I think that you've made some fantastic points there. No doubt we'll delve more into those points as the conversation progresses.
You're stopping me, okay.
Calvin, if we could move on to your introductory statement. Calvin, take away, please.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for this conversation. It's amazing to have a broad and balanced conversation around this fantastic report. Because what's interesting to me is I was invited to speak about this report on the BBC, Talk Radio, Good Morning Britain, Sky News Australia, Times Radio, etc., etc., etc. And all they ever wanted to ask me was about institutional racism, which isn't what this report was about anyway. But the fact that the report didn't find any evidence of institutional racism seems to have grabbed all of the headlines. They didn't want to know that children from ethnic minority communities did as well or better than white pupils in compulsory education. And this success in education has transformed British society over the last 50 years into one offering far greater opportunities for all pupils. Neither did they want to know that the pay gap between all ethnic minorities and the white majority population has shrunk to 2.3% overall and was barely significant for employees under 30. And they didn't want to know that diversity has increased in professions such as law and medicine, which was really frustrating, as you can imagine. So there's a lot of cherry picking of stats and cherry picking of data around conversations, including the most popular one being that midwives tend to treat patients differently if they are Black or white. And if you're a Black mother, you have more chance of dying during childbirth than a white mother. And people were throwing this stat at me as if it was an accusation of racism, as if the NHS is somehow racist towards Black mothers. But if you cherry pick stats like that, you can play the game in reverse too. I can say that how come white cancer patients are more likely to die than Black cancer patients? Is that irrefutable proof of racism in the NHS? Are nurses and doctors treating white patients with cancer less well than they treat Black patients with cancer? I doubt it, because it doesn't pass the common sense test. And none of these cherry-picked stats do, which is why this report was so important, because it was evidence-informed. It delved into the data and looked at what was really going on with these disparities and found that, yes, there are many racial disparities, but they're not irrefutable proof of racism. Another one of the accusations that was flown around was that people such as Dr. Tony Sewell were glorifying the slave trade, which is clearly just mudslinging and smearing and just ad hominem attacks, because why would Tony Sewell, a great person, descendant of slaves himself, be glorifying the slave trade? And it was always white middle-class people throwing this accusation as well, which I found interesting and abhorrent. So using racism as a catch-all excuse clearly doesn't work. If we've looked at this report, we've looked at the data and found that, yes, there are many disparities, but there are many other issues at play. But if we use racism as that catch-all, we undermine genuine racism that is still taking place and needs addressing. But also, it doesn't help to solve the problems that are being ignored. The other issues, such as geography, class, wealth, health, culture, religion, family structures, all of these come into play in our lifestyles in the UK. Single parent families, a lack of English language, poor education, poverty will all have just as much, if not more, of an effect. They are bigger factors actually than race in this country. So the 4 main points of the report I thought were fantastic, very reasonable things that I thought everyone could get behind. Of course, the backlash showed me that they couldn't, and that was a big surprise to me, but I won't go through them. What I will look at briefly is some of the educational recommendations. So there were 6 main recommendations in the educational sector chapter. I will pick my favorite 3 to briefly discuss. So the first one was that we want to replicate the factors for educational success in rural communities. And why this is important is because we've spent so much time in education looking at the lowest common denominators and looking at lower performing groups and finding out why are these communities struggling, what's going on here. But we've spent very little time focusing on areas of high performance. And if we actually focused on why are Chinese kids and Indian kids outperforming other ethnic minority groups in education, why are particular demographics doing so well, let's look at what's going on there and replicate that and make that into a model that we can perform with best practice. And it clearly showed that the data behind this clearly showed that the educational system isn't institutionally racist, when we saw that Black Caribbean kids were underperforming, but likewise Black African kids were excelling all throughout primary and secondary and twice as likely to go to university than white British kids. But another one of the great points from the education chapter was building social and cultural capital. Now, this is one that I feel very strongly about. Being a former director and governor of Michaela School, which is where we started to really try to emphasize this, enriching all pupils, no matter where they're from and what color skin they are, giving them that cultural capital that kids that are from more upper middle class backgrounds or go to privately educated schools would learn through osmosis. So explicitly teaching cultural capital, such as basics like the Lord's Prayer, Jerusalem, the national anthem, Shakespeare sonnets, what many people would consider basic British cultural heritage that isn't necessarily on the national curriculum, but are things that everybody should know or needs to know in order to get by in certain areas of society. And that's what building cultural capital is all about. It's about plugging that gap, that social divide. And then the third point I wanted to briefly address was producing high quality teaching resources through independent agents, not the government, telling stories of what made this country great and what it is today. And I think that point right there is vital, because there are so many politically activist organizations that are pushing their extreme views on schools inadvertently, because schools are grabbing resources, because schools don't use textbooks anymore, they use online resources, and teachers are grabbing resources from the internet in order to teach subjects like Black History Month, quite controversial subjects that they might not feel comfortable producing their own content on. They're grabbing these resources and they are laden with critical race theory and identity politics and all of these hard left views, and that's how they're infiltrating schools. That's how this neo-Marxist regime, so to speak, is infiltrating our education system through the resources. So if we can have high quality resources that are moderated and aggregated in a good independent agency, that would be fantastic and enable teachers to get access to high quality resources around these topics that they're not comfortable designing for themselves, without compromising themselves and without compromising their pupils, which is absolutely of the essence of, we're here to impart knowledge as teachers. We're not here to push an agenda, a political agenda. So we need to keep organisations like Stonewall and Mermaids out from the LGBT conversation, but from the race conversation, like the Black History Project and Black History Month as a political organisation, we need to keep them out just as much. And this recommendation will be a good way of doing that.
For those of you who aren't familiar with our work at the Equiano Project, we are an ideas and discussion forum, and we facilitate conversations related to race relations while promoting the values of universalism, a common humanity, and freedom. Some of the work that we do includes doing school workshops, providing media commentary. I'm sure you know who Inaya Falarani-Man is, our founder. We host our own events on our social media, and we recently reviewed the UK Race Report. I just want to mention that we are almost entirely run on donations. So if you like what we do, we would be grateful if you could support us. But first and foremost, the Equiano Project wants to make it absolutely clear that it condemns the racially motivated and vitriolic comments made onto the commissioners as a result of their work. Overall, we think that the CRED report is the first of its kind because it shifts away from the traditional and usually erroneous approach of attributing disparities and disproportionalities to discrimination. It also calls into question the prior analytical approaches taken to analyze these disparities. And as a result, the CRED report sheds light on the complex and multifaceted reality of health, social, educational, and economic disparities, while still recognizing the prevalence of racism that still exists in Britain. One of the key strengths, and I share this opinion with Alka, of this report is that it divorces itself from the typical identity-oriented solutions to more universal ones which seek to create a fairer society for everybody, irrespective of their ethnic identity. And this comes about by moving away from creating policies that focus on giving minority groups an extra push to actually getting to the core of the problem, whatever that may be, and seeking to remedy it at the source so that these solutions can be applied across all groups of in society, wherever the problem presents. We at the Equiano Project see this as a positive step because it shifts the focus from looking at all situations and problems through a racialized lens. We hope that one day we don't need to look at every single possible issue by virtue of people's skin color. That is our vision. This point transitions me smoothly onto my next point. The report highlights the need to talk about issues that have previously been shunned, maybe out of taboo or sensitivity, which is totally understandable. However, these are important issues that need to be discussed so that the right support is offered by our institutions. Examples of these include the role of family in childhood development and educational outcomes, the glaring problem of geographical wealth inequality, and the misuse and abuse of unconscious bias training. However, once again, these problems are complex and nuanced issues which we can start to discuss tonight. However, nothing is perfect, and this report is no exception to the rule. Being a landmark report will bring about its own limitations and weaknesses, and the Equiano Project identifies a few blind spots. Firstly, we think that there may be an overemphasis on personal agency. Pulling oneself up by one's bootstraps is sometimes not helpful advice. For example, the report did not probe further into the reasons for which Pakistani and Bangladeshi women were economically inactive, and I think they may have found reasons to encourage female empowerment within such communities there. Additionally, we believe that the report substantially lacks examination or recommendations in the areas of social cohesion, community relations, integration, civic participation in particular, all of which are key indicators of whether democratic societies are participatory and inclusive to all members of society. With all things said, however, these are very complicated issues, and in an hour and a half's worth of conversation, I don't think we'll have all the answers. However, we hope this conversation acts as a springboard to other more revealing and fruitful conversations. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Rakib, and thank you, DDU, for organising this evening's event. This event is one in a series of events that commissioners are taking part in to discuss our report with different groups. In the next few weeks, my fellow commissioners and I also have 2 select committees to give evidence to. Our report is really about how you deal with the issue of race and social mobility. As it says in the title of the Commission, we were looking at disparities. and we've made 24 positive recommendations which, if championed by the government, will have a positive impact on people's lives. As a head teacher and now a national leader of education across many schools, almost all of which had serious weaknesses when we sponsored them, with the majority located in areas with some of the biggest disparities, I know only too well that education is the best vehicle for social mobility. Analysis of the latest government data and research that we commissioned, which included a longitudinal study of a nationally representative sample of the achievement of young people at 16 by the highly respected Oxford professor Steve Strand, showed that on average ethnic minority groups achieve higher levels of success in education at age 16 than white British pupils. Education really is the single most emphatic success story of the British ethnic minority experience. The overwhelming picture is that ethnic minority groups have higher educational achievement at age 16 than white British students of the same sex and socioeconomic status. This is particularly notable at low and average socioeconomic status levels, where no ethnic group has a significantly lower score than white British students. And indeed, in 23 of the 32 comparisons that Professor Strand made, the mean score for ethnic minority students is substantially higher than comparable white British students. However, even with this relative success, ethnic variation in outcomes remains. First, Black Caribbean and Black African boys from high socioeconomic status families score substantially lower than comparable white British boys. And second, Pakistani girls from high socioeconomic status backgrounds do not achieve as well as white British high socioeconomic status girls, and substantially below socioeconomic status Pakistani boys, who have the highest mean score of all groupings. The purpose in taking socioeconomic status into account is not, I repeat, not to explain away ethnic achievement gaps, but to better understand the root causes and therefore identify relevant policy interventions and actions. For example, if ethnic achievement gaps reflect the socioeconomic disparities between ethnic groups, then a focus on in-service training to address racism by secondary school teachers would be unlikely to deliver substantial change. Whereas our recommendation, which calls upon government for increased resourcing and deployment of proven interventions for disadvantaged children, regardless of where they live, may have a greater likelihood of success. As an example of one such intervention, in my own schools, we offer thousands of hours of enrichment experiences extending the school day to give children both access to additional small group lessons, as well as opportunities to take part in cultural and sporting events. The phasing in an extended school day in disadvantaged areas first would give all pupils a chance to learn an instrument or make friends for life by joining a local sports team. Now, whilst COVID has particularly hit our most vulnerable and disadvantaged, and the effects will be felt for years to come, our recommendation for an extended school day is one for all time, not just this time. If you're not convinced, consider this. Is it right for a child of 6 that they should have a similar school length day as a child of 16 preparing for their GCSEs? And also consider that at 18, you're doing your A-levels, you have even considerably less time in front of your teacher. If we all agree that education is the key to unlocking potential, then I'm confident that this is a recommendation which can command broad support despite the notable challenges that we identify in our report. Professor Strand's research concluded to the extent that there is a gap for Black Caribbean students that it seemed to reflect structural inequalities in socioeconomic status. To quote directly Professor Strand, he said, "The gaps in achievement at age 16 related to socioeconomic status are large and persistent and represent by far the greatest challenge to equity and social mobility agendas. Educational achievement at 16 is crucial in that it acts as a gatekeeper to higher education and employment opportunities later in life. Nevertheless, ethnic variation in outcomes at later ages still remains. Access to higher tariff universities, entry to work, and the highest occupational groups. It's simply not good enough to waste the talent of so many people, nor to break the cycle between low socioeconomic status and outcomes in later life and the lives of future generations. In education, it's not just the quantity of time children spend in school or the funding for disadvantaged communities that the Commission wants to boost either. We want a new top quality curriculum resources to tell the story of how Britain came to be the country it is today. In the report, the chair of the Commission, Dr. Sewell, said in his introduction, there is a new story about the Caribbean experience which speaks to the slave period, not only being about profit and suffering, but how culturally African people transformed themselves into a remodeled African Britain. this was vilely misrepresented as a glorification of slavery. We wanted to not only speak of the inhumanity of slavery, but how African people managed to retain their humanity and resist slavery, using the data and expertise of Caribbean social historians and other experts like Kunle, for example, who tell the story of how these were real people who kept their aspects of their African culture in religion, dress, dance, food, preparation, etc., and they managed to preserve their humanity. The public culture of Britain is a rich, diverse mosaic of different traditions. Each intricate segment tells its own unique story. But step away and you can see that each part of an overall chronicle, which binds us all together and gives them all a new meaning. It will also reflect the good and the bad of the empire and how that legacy has materially built modern Britain. You can also think of the sacrifices made by the Commonwealth soldiers during the 2 world wars. Linking the stories then of the different ethnic groups into a unifying sense of Britishness is an opportunity to remind children of our common destiny and foster more belonging to this country. Whilst it's painfully true that our report was met with concern and criticism for some, it's equally been received positively by very many others as well. And it's good to see that many of our recommendations are gaining traction and some are already making it through to policy. Early headlines and comments, especially on social media, seem to get worse the more times they were shared and often spun further from the substance of the report, which many had not read. A couple of the most egregious about institutional racism. The Commission found that the term institutional racism was now being used in too generalised a way to help explain race disparities. Our forensic examination of these disparities found that several factors, such as family structure you're born into, where you live, what kind of culture you're growing up in, what quality of education you can expect to receive, lay behind many of these disparities even before race becomes an issue. And their recommendations address those causal factors, which, if implemented, will genuinely help close the gap. I repeat what I said earlier. We do not do this to explain away ethnic achievement gaps, but to better understand the root causes and therefore identify relevant policy interventions and actions. We want to appeal to everybody, but especially to those who have faced and continue to deal with the reality of racism. Our report speaks directly to you. Yes, we did find the racism you experience in our report outlines that reality. Yes, the Commission has found evidence that concurs with your pain. Our report not only acknowledges what we call lived racism, but it delivers key recommendations.
Martyn, if you could kindly wrap up your segment, please, that'd be really good. Thank you.
So we call on the government to accept our very first recommendation to strengthen the hand of the equality watchdog, the EHRC. I've only mentioned 3 of the 24 recommendations, and I'm clearly not going to be able to go through them all, and that wasn't my intention. But overall, the report acknowledges that over 50 years, things have significantly improved. Second, that race is not the only factor in explaining racial disparities. And third, that some of the best strategies for change is when we find answers for everybody. My life has been spent expanding the horizons of disadvantaged young people, and in this report, we make recommendations that address racial inequalities. By no way a finished product, what we have done is give a number of recommendations to significantly move this forward. Thank you.
I felt at least probably the last decade that the whole discourse and discussion of race simply needed to move on. As somebody who's been involved in anti-racist campaigns and intellectual thought for the best part of 25 years, when I came into the charity sector, some of the younger people that I supervised and managed, one of the questions I was asked in my first month at Voice for Change was, what did I think of the race groups and the people doing work around race policy? And I gave them an honest opinion. I felt that many of the ideas and the opinions and the activities they were engaged in were 20 years out of date. And those young people nodded in agreement. So what I'm saying is there is a silent majority out there of critical thinkers in relation to the discourse around race that this report, the context in which this report sits in. And it's with that in mind that I think we should consider some of the points of this discussion and not simply absorb ourselves in the critique of the naysayers and the performative anti-racists that have emerged very vocally in opposition to this report. I think the report was useful in provoking a debate that perhaps some people didn't want to have. There seemed to be too much vested interest in many aspects of what forms anti-racism today, both in terms of the third sector and in terms of the political discourse that has emerged around particularly left-wing thinking. And to that end, I think it's ironic that this report, which was approached fairly faithfully and openly by the commissioners, and in its recommendations, contains ideas and proposals that many of its new critics would themselves have advocated and welcomed. So I think there is a paradox here that there are elements of this report that I myself might be critical of. But in the context of the furore that's been generated by it, we cannot just take it at face value that the issues and the response is governed by the recommendations themselves. So if we look at things like expanding the resource for the Equality and Human Rights Commission, you would have thought that in general, left-leaning liberals would have thought that's an excellent idea. But of course, even that has been slammed. And indeed, so vociferous has the critique been that the baby has been thrown out with the bathwater. So for me, there are questions that I think we want to have in terms of penetrating the use of those recommendations and the nature of their progressiveness, a discussion that we have not yet had. And I'm hoping that this evening we'll be able to get underneath the veneer and get into the substance and detail of those recommendations and how they sit.
Kunle, I found one thing that was very interesting in your segment is that you said you were yourself, you had a critical view of some elements of the report. If you had to pinpoint one area of the report that you'd be most critical of, that could have done, that could have been, can be improved upon, can be built upon or strengthened, which element of the report would you say that is?
I think in terms of the issues relating to effect, there are elements of research that I felt the report needed to delve in further. And certainly when I was asked to become one of the co-opted commissioners, my immediate response was, well, 6 months to address an issue as complex as race. What do you expect to do within that time frame? And what was thrown back to me was, it was the start of initiating a much broader debate. And I felt that given a good enough answer, but in terms of the where we go from here, I suppose is the next question. Given the nature of the opposition to the report, there is, I think, and this is something that Alka alluded to, a gap that needs to be filled in terms of addressing the issues that have been thrown back in our face. So to look at another example, one of the dimensions that was not part of the remit was immigration. And certainly the question of Windrush in the narrative around the lack of evidence around institutionalized racism falls within that gap. And so for me, I'm satisfied that a debate has been provoked, but I think that there's definitely more work to be done there. And I think also there's a problem of coming onto the same ground as your opponents, rather than attempting to shape the narrative yourself. And I think there's too much of attempting to actually move onto the ground of those that are, I suppose, for want of a better term, the kind of traditional stalwarts of the race industry.
Martyn, with your experience in education, one thing I wanted to ask you was, we know a fair bit about the fairly relatively low outcomes, educational outcomes among working class boys in England. If you had to pinpoint the main drivers in terms of what driving those negative outcomes, because you even see within among working class pupils more generally, that still there's other ethnic groups such as working class children of Bangladeshi origin, Black African origin. Their outcomes are superior in terms of educational attainment when compared with working class white British pupils. So what do you think are the main drivers of those particular disparities within within the section of working class pupils in the English education system?
Sure. Well, I think that as is one of our key recommendations about the careful use of data, we've got to be really careful not to make broad, sweeping judgments. So, for example, we know that 40%, I think it's 40% of all the ethnic minorities live in London, and London schools have had a great transformation. So you have to look, you can't say that all white disadvantaged boys are doing badly, because I highlight in the report a school where white disadvantaged boys have done exceptionally well when an academy trust took them over and turned it around in just 1 year. So not all white disadvantaged boys do badly. Some do exceptionally well when they've got the right leadership and the right conditions in their schools. Not all Black Caribbean boys do really badly. We spoke to academy trusts like the brilliant trust Harris in London, where there are students doing exceptionally well. And so you've got to be very careful, I think, not to make broad sweeping judgments. What we do know, and touching upon some of Alka's points, that if we look at what Her Majesty's Chief Inspector said, and I would completely agree as an experienced head teacher, there are core elements to great schools. I don't mean good in terms of Ofsted. So when we say good teaching, good curriculum, I don't mean Ofsted good. I mean just great teaching, great curriculum, great behaviour. Now, what happens if you go into a disadvantaged school where you've got 60, 70% of children who are disadvantaged? Your leadership team starts to spend hundreds and hundreds of hours focusing on all of the child protection and safeguarding issues that take place. I have two schools 20 miles apart, very similar, 70% free school meal in one, 19% free school meal in the other. The leadership team in the free school meal with 19% spend most of their time talking about the quality of teaching and learning. The leadership team with the school with 70% free school meal spend a tremendous amount of their time talking about safeguarding and investigating keeping children safe. That's why there's a disparity, and we need to find greater funding, greater resources, not broadly targeted at all white disadvantaged boys, but at the areas, micro areas within communities, schools, classes, where that performance isn't good enough.
Alka, if I could just ask you a question based on your previous remarks. So you felt more generally in terms of the report, when it came to education itself, you felt that there were certain sort of methodological approaches, you could say, that were undervalued in the report. Say we take the report, we see the value in it. If we were to do a report purely based on looking at the education system, examining what are driving disparities between different groups, Martyn's obviously talked about the importance of looking at geographical variation, in the sense that there may be working class pupils in one part of the country which are performing better, and then looking at what's really driving that. But you feel that should just be beyond looking at the statistical data. So in terms of what we should be really adopting in terms of methodology, what are the key approaches that you would really recommend moving forwards in the realm of education?
Well, I think Martyn's just kind of demonstrated one, actually. For me, the key thing Martyn pointed out was not the geographical difference, but it was the difference in the senior leadership team, in what they were doing. Yeah, one senior leadership team was focusing on externally imposed outcomes that actually have very little to do intrinsically with the curriculum and the knowledge. Now, and I can guarantee you this is borne out by my experience. And if you think about it, if you're looking for like the best examples, if you look at, this isn't perhaps so true so much now, but in the past, the autonomy and freedom of in the private sector of teachers to teach the subject with relatively far, with actually a lot less external constraints was, I think, one factor that would help. So in terms of the methodologies, I think when you're looking at education, there isn't one ready-made. I think you need a multidisciplinary approach. You would need to work out your values. Then you would need to work out a hypothesis, drawing on history, sociology, educational theory, current educational theory, psychology, the core disciplines of education that have been hollowed out of, actually removed from teacher education since the 90s, right? And then you work out a hypothesis, and then from that you construct the kind of empirical research you need to test your hypothesis. Yeah, that will give you a kind of much more robust explanatory account that will be more helpful for policy making, I think.
So, Calvin, many people who have engaged with you over the CRED report, the topic that often comes up is institutional racism in the UK. When you look at data which shows that 6 in 10 Black British people think that the UK has a fundamentally racist society, or 6 in 10 Black British people feel that their local police force treats their racial group unfairly, what do you feel is really driving that? I know that's quite a big question, because I think the risk here is to say, well, actually, that's not true. This is a figment of your imagination, which I think would actually be quite destructive from a social cohesion perspective. You already see that there's quite fragile state-citizen relations there. So essentially, you have the general population, 3 in 10 people, only 3 in 10 people feel the UK is a fundamentally racist society. It goes up to 6 in 10 for Black British people. What do you think what do you think would be good starting points in terms of helping to bridge that gap? Naturally, you don't want to bridge the gap by the general population, more of them thinking that, but rather decreasing that 6 in 10 number among the Black British population. What would be the really good starting points? How do we move forwards in that front?
That's interesting, isn't it? Because we're now talking about people's feelings. And this report was obviously about the stats. It was about the information. It was about the data. But yeah, people do. There is a perception amongst a large group of people that this is an institutionally racist country. And we can't break that feeling with the stats. We can't break that feeling with evidence to suggest that it's not. So how do we present a reality to a perception? And I think that starts in education, because we are stuck right now in this self-perpetuating rut of, the teacher training schools are teaching teachers a certain, let's say, political viewpoint, and teachers going to schools, very well-intentioned, very well-meaning, wanted to make a difference to these poor ethnic minority kids by using the tools that they have to hand. And one of those tools is expectations. Here I'm talking about the soft bigotry of low expectations. It is that lowering standards for kids of ethnic minority status, saying that if you're from a disadvantaged background, or if you're from an ethnic minority background, or whatever demographic they're trying to support, then you have a different level to reach than the rest of the kids. And that, along with the rhetoric that they peddle, telling young Black kids that they have hurdles to overcome, or that they're going to have a harder life, or they're not going to achieve success, etc., because the system is set up against them, or because of racism in our society. And again, this is all self-perpetuating. If you tell kids this often enough, they'll start to believe it. So in order to fix it, we reverse that and stop peddling divisive, toxic nonsense and start pushing real positive rhetoric instead. If we teach young children about a more holistic history, yes, show them more Black soldiers that fought in World War II from Jamaica, along with more soldiers from other parts of the Commonwealth, such as Australia, being holistic and inclusive with it, but at the same time tell them, this is a democratic society, it's a meritocratic society, and all of you have a chance of achieving success if you work hard enough. Just point to examples like the most diverse cabinet and most diverse government we've had in a long time. Point to the fact that we have an ethnic minority in the royal family now. You can achieve the upper echelons of society if you set your mind to it. You can beat anything in this country if you work hard enough. That is what we have to keep pushing. And if we do that, instead of allowing teachers to peddle the negative rhetoric, that self-perpetuating cycle will flip in reverse. And that is how we turn it around, I think.
And Zara, in your introductory statement, I thought what was really interesting, you talk about those themes of participatory democracy. social cohesion, institutional trust. In the report itself described the UK as essentially a race relations model when it comes to white majority, multi-ethnic societies. Do you feel that was a bit of an overreach? And if you do think that was a bit of an overreach, which other countries do you think that fit in with those characteristics, maybe doing better than Britain in some ways when it comes to having, sort of participatory democratic engagement, and a more socially cohesive population, and perhaps higher levels of institutional trust as well?
Yeah, I would definitely think that it was a bit of an overreach. Not to say that no progress has been made at all, but if you actually have a look at the MIPEX, which is the Migrant Integration Index, you'll find that the UK doesn't even come in the top 10 or even the top 15. You'll find countries like Sweden, Norway, Canada, even Brazil to be in that top range. And the reason for which this happens is because there are stronger feelings of civic participation among young people. Even America is in the top 20. And what you find is there is a cultural difference between the UK and countries like America. When you're younger, there is a huge focus on what you can do for your community. When you apply to universities, your application has a great deal of what you've done in terms of volunteering, and there are lots of scholarships available for young people, which come under the title of citizen scholars or public scholars. We don't have that. When you apply via a UCAS system, maybe you'll have a paragraph in your personal statement about what you've done in terms of volunteering or what you've done for society. But there's not a great emphasis. And I also have done some school workshops for the Equiano project. And what I found is that, in doing so, I like to look at different resources from different countries. When you look at citizenship education in the US or in Canada, what you'll have is, you'll have questions like, what does it mean to be a good citizen? And a lot of the time what you'll have is resources that say that, being patriotic is an example of someone being a good citizen. I looked at that and I just thought, there's no way I could go into a school and say things like that, because I think we've become a society that is so embarrassed of our past, embarrassed of our present, and I think potentially embarrassed of our future. And so if we are able to overturn that kind of cultural, milieu, I think progress can be made. But yeah, I do think it's a bit of an overstretch to say that the UK is a great or one of the superior models for integration.
There's been one question that's been asked to the panel. According to this individual, they felt their reading of the report was that the report is essentially saying that stable family structures, or rather the type of family structure, is strongly associated with a number of social and economic outcomes. So on the basis of that, how can we work towards a more sort of family-centric social policy agenda without stigmatizing single parents? That is the crux of the question. So Alka, I know that you have some passionate views on these kind of topics. So if I could direct the question towards you first, that'd be really
Okay, well, first of all, just quickly on family values, which generally, I don't know if this is an age thing, but generally I've become more supportive of, much more so than when I was 16 anyway. But and that's kind of my point really, is that I think you need family values, but there's also something to be said for the kind of more civic or liberal idea of individualism. Because if I'd have gone along with family values, I'd have been married 20 years earlier to the wrong person probably, and not be where I am now if I'd have taken the whole kind of family values agenda and being obedience and all the things that are entailed with that. For me, I think what's more important is to locate what the values are that are conducive to building solidarity and to having a positive orientation to the world and people around you, so you don't feel like everything is against you, when, you know, maybe some things are, but not everything in the blanket way that we're being told it is. And I think the problem there is not, it's not kind of a technical institutional one, it's one of trust. And that's one of the things in the report, isn't it, to try and build trust. And there you hit upon a real problem, right? Because this is the ironic thing. This is where a bit of philosophy comes in. To have trust, you need to have risk. You need to have uncertainty. If you didn't have that, there would be no need for trust, right? So, and we're in a culture at the minute, as you know, is quite hostile and finds it very difficult to kind of accept it, you know, any idea of risk or uncertainty. The quest for certainty and predictability, you know, certainly has its place in certain aspects of life, but you know, it's also very restrictive, and it can make people more brittle and inward looking. So I think we need to find ways of really promoting a positive sort of a willingness to understand, you know, you might fail, things might go wrong, someone might be horrible to you, but you can get over it. There are other ways of dealing with it that will actually strengthen the social bonds that you need rather than erode them.
No, thank you for that, Alka. And Calvin, if I could just come to you, looking at that particular question, you know, yourself having experience in the education sector, especially with Michaela, which is a very high-performing school. To what extent do you feel, more generally, family culture? That was one of the phrases that was used in the report. How important do you feel that those family dynamics, the family structure, and more broadly, perhaps the kind of culture which is cultivated within households towards education, how important do you feel they are when we're looking at ethnic disparities in terms of educational performance in the English school system?
Absolutely essential, Dr. Rakib. This is the quintessence of what makes education work. When we talk about, so look at the racial disparities in this report, we talk about why are Black African kids doing so much better than Black Caribbean kids as a prime example. That is because Black Caribbeans tend to, and I'm generalizing here, I know it goes against what Martyn said earlier, but I'm generalizing on a large scale. Black Caribbean kids tend to be, well, Black Caribbean families tend to have moved over here during the Windrush generation, integrated into British society a long time ago, and are very much part of British culture and are performing similarly to white British kids. Black African families tend to be newer immigrants to the country and bring with them that sense of family values and the idea that education is a tool for social mobility. It's the route to success or the route out of poverty, either or, but we've kind of lost that in our British culture. Unfortunately, we need to readapt that and adopt it from the newer immigrants that have come over here. And I'm going to take a slightly controversial stance and argue with Alka a little bit here on the individualism front, because while I do support individualism, of course, when I'm talking about, you know, we need to not let the left put us in boxes and homogenize the whole Black community into one, etc. But at the same time, we have to use individualism with moderation, because we're more than individuals. It's become, you know, we need to focus on more than just our own personal goals and happiness. As Charlotte Miller mentioned in the comments, we need to remind ourselves of this sense of service and duty to our family and then to our wider community, because we are all individuals, but part of a wider whole. And that, again, is something I think is missing from British culture at the moment, and something we can adopt from newer immigrant families.
Kunle, we saw that in the report that it talks that one of the policy recommendations is about offering support to communities at risk of family breakdown. But I'd say that more generally, my reading of the report is that it's provided that recommendation, but it's a bit light in terms of how that can take shape in terms of policy. How would, if we were to follow up on that recommendation through policy, what kind of shape do you think those policies could take?
I think, again, your question gets at the crux of one of the most controversial aspects of the report, which is the disparities between different ethnic communities in terms of outcome. Again, the report was criticized for placing an emphasis on those different outcomes, and it was explained as being divisive. I think in terms of the remedies that are put forward in almost peripatetic attempts to target those or ethnic groups where you can see disparities at a consistent level. I think that requires a lot more thought and a lot more nuance in terms of its application. Certainly, in its kind of crude presentation, it does seem to suggest that there is some kind of blanket solution that if concentrated efforts are focused on those families, the solutions can be found. I think, we have to also step away sometimes and ask more questions about what's actually being put forward. It was once suggested to me many years ago when I was working in social care that rather than putting kids into care situations, it would have been better to have bought their parents a house and given them £150,000, and you would have actually and sent them to private school, and you would have got better outcomes because the same level of resources would be pumped into those kids and their families with negative outcomes. And I remember thinking, well, solution, but can you imagine the politics and the barriers that you'd have to actually go through in order to deploy something like that, even as an experiment? And so it really speaks to, I think, some of the things that Calvin's been touching on, which is that in terms of the solutions may really be drawn from both structure, but also from a recognition of, I think, a social space that gives rise to the allowance of individuality, which is something that I think is, again, something of a paradox within the discussion around race, which is a recognition of the need for individual autonomy. When individual autonomy is exercised, the same race experts are the first people to come down on those expressions of individuality.
If I could move to Zara, just building on that question a bit further, do you feel that we saw some of the reactions to the report? Do you feel that, to an extent, that anti-racism discussion in the UK, it's generally in recent times it's gone into a negative direction, in that instead of really looking at what are driving disparities between different racial groups, there have been attempts to sideline the importance of family culture, the high trust nature of communities, the quality of leadership in educational institutions. When we do have organizations, they've almost looked to place race at the forefront on discussions on disadvantage. Do you think that that's been a problem more generally in recent years in the UK?
I do think so, that this is a problem, especially when you look at it from universities kind of front. What you see here is in the UK since the 1980s, a political scientist called Robert Ford has looked at this. What we have is, I was in his class actually, what we have is this democratic shift whereby graduates are now dictating the political trope, and it's a problem when universities are pushing a certain type of agenda. So if you look at my university, for example, when the murder of George Floyd happened in America, and that brought on its shockwaves, my university released a reading list for everybody, and they subsidized that. So they paid for people to read critical race theory books, things like White Fragility, things like White Privilege by Peggy McIntosh. And I didn't have a problem that those books were on the reading list themselves. I think at the end of the day, they are ideas. But what I had a problem with was its selectiveness. You didn't have people like Martin Luther King's work on there, Booker T. Washington, Frederick Douglass. You didn't have any other kind of variation. It was a very specific and narrow trope. And it's concerning because what happens is these young people come out of university and they get integrated into real life. They become the policymakers and they become people in power. And it does become concerning because what happens is the fact that you've got this particular ideas around anti-racism which are hardwired, and any kind of meaningful discussion such as looking at the role of families and other kind of nuanced issues, they're kind of sidelined. So I do think it is a problem. And I think it starts primarily at universities.
And Martyn, I think it was quite interesting listening to the Queen's speech. It's almost about the government really wants to embark on this skills revolution. So do you feel more generally, when it's slightly, I wouldn't say completely off topic, but is it the case that when it comes to the education system, one of the main flaws perhaps is that in recent times there's been too much of an emphasis on academic formal education? And what we need to do, we need to create more diverse pathways to people to excel on the education front, whether they take the academic route or the vocational route.
Yeah, so I mean, that just goes to many of the points, and again to a lot of things that Alka said about what's the purpose of education. And so education for education's sake is an entirely valid argument. But one of the things that we also talk about in the report is about ensuring that children get onto good courses. And by good courses, it means that it has the potential to open the doors for their next steps. And that's whether it's stay in academia or it's go and get jobs. But courses where you're simply paying your £9,000 tuition fee and your prospects of getting employment at the end of it have probably been harmed, not helped, are simply a waste of talent. And so when we talked about, for example, the Office for Students and using the access funds, well, the access funds belong to the universities, but it's millions and millions of pounds. And quite rightly, as Alka said, that often goes in at 16 years of age. Well, it's too late, 16. So we talked a lot, and you'll have to forgive the fact that between what was written in the report and the 9 months worth of conversations, I sometimes get blurred. But we certainly talked an awful lot about how those interventions in school need to happen at primary school. They can't start at 14, 15, 16 when already the pathway, or certainly at 17, 18, when the pathway is already far too established. So I think the further education debate, getting skills, I think that they're incredibly important. I also noted in the Queen's speech that they mentioned about there'll be policy on race and racial disparity. So we're quite looking forward to seeing the government's response to our 24 recommendations.
Okay, so we received a question from David Green, and he's asked, do the panelists sympathise with the French government policy of not collecting racial stats in order to emphasise national citizenship? Now, I might give my opinions on this because I've written about this before. But maybe starting with Kunle, what do you think more generally about this question, that where you have France, it's almost this colourblind egalitarianism, a real scepticism towards collecting data based on race and ethnicity? Should Britain follow that kind of path in order to emphasise national cohesion? Well, in an effort to do that.
I mean, a few years back at Paris University, I attended an international conference with trade unions from across Europe, and came up against trade union organisers from the Touvrière and members of the CGT, who pronounced in front of a very kind of British and very woke delegation their assertion of French notions of individual liberty, and of course, again, the question of not wanting to see people as identities, but as citizens. And as somebody coming from Britain, it's a very attractive notion, I've got to be honest. However, when you look at French society and levels of discrimination, it's obvious that one of the problems of the aspirations of the French Revolution has been the incomplete nature of it and its application. To its extent, no would be my answer. I think we're looking at a society that glosses over some very deep-seated divisions. And as I think has already been alluded to, in terms of the practice of racial discourse in Britain, I think there are many kind of admirable attributes that we should actually celebrate vis-a-vis what has been the experience, particularly of migrant workers and of Black and Arab French.
Would anyone else on the panel offer a different view to Kunle? Martyn?
I just wanted to say, and I'll try and cover some of the questions that were appearing in the chat at the same time, and things Alka said. That, so, for example, the education report, that chapter particularly, I wrote significant chunks, the vast majority of it. And as an educationalist, I love data, and I can be accused, Alka, of getting too sucked into the data. I'll take that criticism, but we were focusing on evidence, and I think education of all of the sectors, of all of the sections, health, crime, employment, we were very rich in data. So to say that we wouldn't have had that data, we were not collecting that data, I think would have been a huge issue. And whilst I don't have the figures on France, when we looked at the European, the EU and the agency there for British respondents and black harassment, we had the second lowest across all of the EU. And I can't help but wonder if it's the fact that we're transparent about looking at ethnic disparities and the performance and the experience of different ethnic groups. So to not have that data, I think is frankly the wrong thing to do.
No, but and I have to say that generally I agree with that, your view and Kunle's view. I think the colourblind egalitarianism, the almost obsession with creating a one indivisible republic, has somewhat backfired, because I think there are certain issues when, certain social and economic problems where it is worth at least investigating on racial and ethnic terms. And I think that, unfortunately, that has been a problem for France. There is one question here which I'd like to ask Calvin, because Calvin, you talk a great deal about, the meritocratic, meritocratic values, equality of opportunity. You would say on the whole that Britain is has a meritocratic society, but do you feel there are areas of improvement in British society in terms of strengthening of equality of opportunity? And if you do, which sectors do they need to be improved upon?
Yes. So I don't think we have a meritocratic society. I think that's what we're working towards. We do have equality under the law, which is a great thing. Areas for improvement when it comes to meritocracy, I would say, are in the Equalities Act. I would say we need to repeal the Equalities Act and/or replace the protected characteristics, because at the moment, the protected characteristics in the Equalities Act are used incorrectly, because it's interpreted that positive action should be positive discrimination. And as we know, that's not the case. That's not what it's intended for. It was intended to protect minority groups, but instead it's been used in the reverse to overcorrect in many instances. We're now seeing jobs advertised specifically for Black people or, different other minority groups. And that's not what it was intended to do at all. And it's gone completely the opposite way, and it doesn't work. So either we add many more protected characteristics for other groups that aren't represented, like white working class individuals, or we remove them entirely, or we repeal the act.
Thank you, Calvin. Zara, would you like to build on the points that Calvin has made in terms of suggesting the scrapping of protected characteristics as listed in the Equality Act?
I think it's really interesting because now you have people claim for protectionism under, the beliefs of veganism and things like that. So I think it's very interesting what he says. If you look at Channel 4, they've got this scheme called, I think it's called Blackout, where they will basically disrupt normal television for about 24 hours. And they will showcase Black talent on screen and off screen. I don't want to make any solid conclusions about this because I might not be right here, but I think it does could potentially breach the Equalities Act itself. In order to have something like that, one needed to, discriminate on the basis of someone's skin color. And so I think I would agree with him in that sense that really does need to be reviewed and perhaps even reformed.
No, thank you. Would anyone express a slightly different view to Calvin on the panel, and would they like to express that view?
Yeah, can I say something?
Of course, Alka, as always.
It's not really to disagree with Calvin, but it's more to make another point about the meritocratic or social mobility debate, which is, it's not long term, the expansion of education has actually coexisted with the decrease of social mobility. There's a study, I think, done by Alice Sullivan, is one of the researchers at Institute of Education in London, and she's in charge of the longitudinal data. So there are two mega longitudinal. I'm not totally against data, by the way, Martyn. Studies, the birth cohort and the millennium study, I think, and she shows that there's actually less chance of the younger, more recent cohort of younger generation reaching the same standard of living and wage equality as their parents than the earlier generation. And this decline has been concurrent with the expansion of education through raising the school leaving ages primarily, and then the massification of higher education. So it's not just as simple as thinking you can kind of culturalize your way to social mobility or through education. I think the main presupposition of meritocracy is that there are enough spaces at the top for people to rise up through their efforts. But if the whole economy and whole way of arranging production in society is paralyzed or static or reducing, then that will have knock-on effects downstream as well in terms of mobility.
Panel, I'm aware of the time, so I think we'll move on to the sort of closing statements. So if you just for 2 to 3 minutes each, if you could essentially say, moving forwards, how do we create a more socially cohesive, meritocratic society? What are the things that we should really focus on and how we go about that? I know that's a big ask, but I think it's good to at least have we'll have no doubt generate a diversity of points across the panel. So Kunle, you had co-opted member of the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities. You even said that you were critical of certain aspects of the report. So would you say those aspects that you're critical of, that in a way for you would be the areas that maybe we should build upon in terms of delivering high quality, in-depth research?
I think it's not just a question of research, as has been said in the discourse around the conversation. Data and information certainly is one area, but in terms of being able to also produce a compelling narrative that is supported by the kind of data that underpins this report. And I think for me, it's about building a narrative that enables particularly our young people to understand the opportunities and the range of things that they can do to challenge the orthodoxy of failure that unfortunately has been all too readily presented of the approach of this report. So whilst I may be critical of the kind of fine detail, in terms of the general direction of travel, I think the report has a lot to recommend it. And it certainly lit a fire under our opponents. And for that, if nothing else, I think it should be, to a certain extent at this time, defended. When we go into the detail of it, there is fine-tuning to be done. But overall, I would say that, and I know that I work with a lot of these race organisations, the preparation for slamming and hammering this report was well in advance before the report came out, by at least 3 months. I've been in those forums with people like Lord Woolley, who was chomping at the bit to destroy this report. There is, I think, something else that needs to happen, which is that old guard, not just in the UK, but also in America. The Al Sharptons of this world need to be thoroughly intellectually discredited. And I think we're just beginning that journey.
Martyn, moving over to you, we see that that the report in itself, it did signal a break from these tired and outmoded sort of orthodoxy surrounding racial disparities, namely that disparities equal discrimination. And I think that was one thing about the report, it was really rejecting that and really hammering home the point. There are a myriad social, cultural, economic, geographic, all the rest of those factors can feed into these disparities between different racial and ethnic groups. Moving forwards, if we're looking at the research, not so much the kind of research that can be done, but looking at the recommendations, what kind of policy shape they can take, especially in terms of education. When we're looking at the education system more generally, what do you think are the main improvements that really need to be made in terms of creating a more robust, but also an education system which really delivers for different pupils across the country?
Well, thank you. And I will answer that one. I was going to answer your previous one as well, which was the closing statement. And so if I just try and do both, and I'll do them much faster than my clearly long 5-minute intro. So first thing, just to go back to that previous question, is I'd like people to read the report, but if they can't read the report, read the recommendations, and then actually start lobbying government. This was an independent report by an independent commission. We actually haven't made this easy at all. If you look at the 24 recommendations, I feel slightly guilty with the impact of the COVID on the economy. They're expensive, and we've not made this easy at all. So I'd like people to start lobbying government to see the 24 recommendations actually enacted. And of course, I would like all the education ones absolutely enacted, because I generally think we're having there's a real moment in education right now where we're starting to tip into research, and we're engaging with teachers. We talk about being professionals, and if you're going to be a professional, you have to engage in professionalism, and that doesn't mean making it up or guessing how you teach children. It means using the very best research out there and applying that methodically. What you see in the health profession is what you should see in the teaching profession. So a strong, knowledge-rich curriculum, engaged in research, teaching and learning, leadership, actually focusing on teacher training and the research. So we want to see all of those things, but of course we need to create the conditions where the disparities that I talked about in schools with high disadvantaged areas are not, where the playing field is at least level, where those schools have a chance working with all of the actors, social services, police, local authority, mental health support being a massive element of this. We need all of those agencies to act and support, and schools to act as civic trusts civically in society. So I'll stop there.
No, thank you, Martyn. And Alka, just we could come to you for your closing comments.
Okay, well, I suppose I'll just go really general here on what I'd like to see. I love the main thing I loved about the report that I would really like to see extended all over in whatever you're talking about is its insistence that any kind of claim or accusation or claim to truth doesn't need any support at all. And I don't mean it needs stats necessarily, but it could be logically reasoned as well, yeah, or a combination. You need to. So that I would love that kind of value of truth, and particularly important in education. And I think I would like to see a movement or some kind of representation that was really about re-enlightenment, if you like, sort of getting rid of the safetyism, a positive attitude to freedom and risk, which links into the idea of truth, because actually, if you're going to look for the truth, then you've got to be quite prepared to take a risk because you might not like what you find. So, that the kind of antipathy to risk also does affect knowledge itself and education, and preservation of aspects of our past and preservation of standards in knowledge and education, not with a view of just sort of preserving them in what's the word, aspic, but to create a step to go forward and to find out where how to go forward positively and democratically.
No, thank you for your closing comments there, Alka. And Calvin, if I could move on to your closing remarks, please.
I'll follow that. That was perfect. We need to value truth again. I love that. Not my truth, the truth. We need to move away from unconscious bias training, these kinds of wacky ideas, and go back towards traditional coaching and mentoring. We need to disaggregate the term BAME, take a load of these recommendations. We don't need to explain away ethnicity, but we do need to consider other aspects such as, in education, SEN, but also geography, socioeconomic status, poverty, community, all of these things. And to wrap up, I want to say a brief quote from the DDU response to the report, which is that the report recommends approaches to problems of material and cultural disadvantage that consider all ethnic groups rather than treat people as members of discrete groups. Such approaches are less likely to foster division and resentment and are more compatible with principles of solidarity and equality.
Thank you for that, Calvin. And Zara, if I could come to you for your closing remarks.
I'm going to leave it on a positive. I think there's so much opportunity for building a civic identity. I mean, if you look at what's going on in Europe, you've got the Hungarian Prime Minister saying that Hungarian identity is fixated in Hungarian ethnicity, which is a very exclusionary view of national identity. I think we can divorce ourselves from that kind of racial antipathy. I think, if you look at previous studies, if you ask participants what it means to be truly British, a lot of them will answer, well, yeah, there is the civic element, but there is also the ethnic element too. And I think there's a real opportunity to challenge that. There are other studies that show that ethnic minorities may have a functional or technical attachment to civic identity rather than a sentimental one. So there is great opportunity to kind of build an effective relationship with our civic identity. And I think that can start with young people. I myself was part of the UK Youth Parliament, and shortly after, when I was in sixth form at the time, but the National Citizen Service came out, and I think we could really use them as vectors for teaching young people about the importance of volunteering, building trust within the community, voting, learning about the rule of law. There's also so many opportunities now, after COVID, for museums and public spaces to become spaces for education and building civic identity. There's this really good book out by Elizabeth Weiss that looks at these public spaces and the opportunity they have that, we can use them for in order to build civic identity, interfaith community building, relationship building, and also intergenerational community building too. So I think there's so much opportunity next year as well. Next year there will be the Queen's Platinum Jubilee. We could all do something for that and bind together on our common humanity and our collective identity as British citizens. There's so much opportunity.
No, thank you for that, Zara, for closing the event so wonderfully. I'd like to thank our panelists, Kunle, Martyn, Alka, Calvin and Zara, for their insightful contributions. I found it to be a very intellectually stimulating conversation, which could have carried on well into the evening, but I've got a bit hungry now, so I have to call it a day.